The heat in Giddings held past noon, hitch rails ticking as they cooled in the shade. Wagons rolled to a stop along Main Street, wheels creaking, and men stepped down in their Sunday coats to join the crowd pushing toward the scaffold. A rope hung ready from the crossbeam, a new hemp line coiled and tied off to the post, promising a quick drop. On the platform, a carpenter wiped sawdust from his hands. The sheriff checked the trap with his boot, lifted and dropped it once, and nodded. Out past the courthouse lawn, kids climbed fence rails for a better look, the way boys do around anything that smells like danger. Someone said the prisoner had asked for a last smoke. Someone said he'd asked for a priest. On October 11th, 1878, William Preston Bill Longley, called Bloody Bill, from years of boasting and violence, was about to meet the end he never believed would catch him. He had tried to live by nerve and luck from the first time he ran. He grew up just miles from where the scaffold stood, long bones and black hair, quick with a gun and quicker to anger. After the war, he fell in with rough men on tired horses, shaking down travelers and freedmen on lonely roads. When law closed in, he pushed on, Bell County to the Brazos Bottoms, then south and west, where railheads and cattle money meant easy liquor and new grudges. He learned to smile in saloons, to watch hands near belts, and to move first. He told anyone who'd listen that he had fought his way through gun battles that would have made a dime novelist blush. The truth was uglier and smaller. Most of the dead never drew on him. In March of 1875, he carried a borrowed shotgun to the gate of a farm near Evergreen, where his old schoolmate Wilson Anderson was mending a fence. They had fished the same creeks as boys. That afternoon, Longley stepped close enough to see his own reflection in the man's eyes and pulled both triggers. He said later the killing was for a family quarrel he had made his own. Then he said different things to different people, depending on what he wanted from them. He swung back into the saddle, told his brother to ride, and the dust ate their tracks. He kept moving after that. He worked corn rows for a preacher and shot him down beside a cow when the law turned its face his way. He nursed grudges until they looked like reasons. There were nights when the rope nearly found him. Once the mob had him high enough for his feet to kick, and gunfire, wild and meant for fear, cut the rope so he fell, gulping air, the tree lifting and swaying above him like a ship's mast. Another time, the knot slipped, and he hit the dirt hard, and in the confusion, a friend's horse came shouldering through bodies to drag him out. He called it Providence when he wanted to impress a woman, and plain luck when he was drunk. By 1876, he'd pushed into Louisiana under a new name, living mean and quiet around hayfields and swamps. In June 1877, the sheriff from back home followed a whisper and knocked at a cabin where a man called Bill Jackson was eating breakfast. Longley looked up and saw guns. He didn't lift his. He came back in irons, hungry and exhausted, and took a place on a bench in a Texas jail where the stones stayed cool even in summer. He ran his mouth when he had an audience, then shut it when the judge came in. The trial in Lee County turned on the murder of Wilson Anderson. There were people willing to swear Longley had bragged about it, and all of them carried the memory of his temper like a burn. He had lawyers and time to speak, and he kept his charm where the jury could see it. It didn't help. In September 1877, the verdict came, guilty. His appeal reached Austin and came back with the stamp that meant the law had nothing more for him. He read the date on the writ and went quiet. Jail gave him hours to write letters, and he used them. In some, he cut his count of killings back to numbers he could almost justify. In others, he puffed himself big as legends, pistol duels on dusty streets, men slapped into gunfire and buried without names, a life bent by fate into the shape of a story. He told a preacher he had made peace with God. He told a guard the sheriff had no stomach for real work. He told a visitor he could still talk his way past a rope if anybody would let him try. In cells on either side, men rolled their eyes in the dark and pulled blankets over their heads. The morning of his hanging, he dressed in clean clothes and took a last look west toward the country he had roamed. The sheriff came with deputies and a small, professional sadness. They walked him out under a warm blue sky where a crowd waited with the hush of church and the restless shift of a fairground. Longley's face was leaner, his mouth tighter than his jailhouse stories had drawn him. He stepped onto the platform, spine straight, as if the boards were a dance floor, and he felt the measure of the song. A minister prayed in a firm voice. The sheriff asked if Longley had final words. He did. He told the gathered he had sinned, that whiskey and hard company had set his feet wrong, that boys should mind their mothers and work their fields. He said he had killed fewer men than the papers claimed and more than any decent man could excuse. He might have said, as he'd hinted before, that the frontier made hard choices. He might have smiled and tried to turn one last story in his favor. He looked out over faces and saw no room for that. When he finished, the sheriff nodded to the hangman. The noose went over his head, the knot set tight under his jaw. The hood came down and turned the world into cloth and breath. He shifted his weight like a man settling into a chair he doesn't trust. The sheriff raised his hand, dropped it, and the trap swung open. The rope was new and long. The drop mismeasured. Longley hit the ground with his boots under him. A gasp rolled through the crowd like wind through wheat. For a slow heartbeat, it looked as if the man who had cheated the noose before would cheat it again. Deputies hauled him up hand over hand, the line singing across the beam. He kicked, and then he didn't. Boys at the fence watched without blinking until someone told them to look away. Men took off their hats. Women stared at the boards of the platform because it was easier than looking at the man. The doctor stepped forward, set fingers at the neck, and waited longer than any bystander could stand still. He gave the sheriff a look and a small shake of the head that told everyone what they had come to see and none of what they had come to feel. The body went to a wagon. The crowd tore into arguments that would last years, about mercy, about the law, about whether anything that ends with a rope could ever be called justice when the dead could not speak back. Then, the rumors started to run. In saloons from Giddings to Galveston and out along the cattle trails, men said a rich uncle had arranged a trick rope and a harness under the shirt. They said a double had swung, and a living man had been cut down behind the curtain. They said he had crossed the border that night and taken land somewhere with warm winters. They said whatever made the story good enough to drink to. Longley helped those stories live by being the kind of man who had bragged and lied when he breathed. The families he'd broken did not drink to any of it. The Andersons buried their grief the way farm people do, by working until their hands ached. Preachers in Bell counties told boys to leave pistols alone and take up plows. Rangers rode out after other hard men because the state still had more. And in Giddings, just a few miles from where he had been raised, a plain marker fixed his name and the day the wind stopped in his lungs. Time gave the town a new courthouse and better roads. The grave remained. Even decades later, old men would lean back in chairs and say the rope had been wrong, that they had seen him stand after the trap dropped, that it proved something or nothing depending on who told it. Far from Texas, people with a taste for frontier legends said the outlaw had gone to ground and raised sons under a false name. The truth never shouted. It stayed like a coin at the bottom of a well, hard to see there whether or not you wanted what it could buy. What holds is this. A boy from Lee County learned he could take what he wanted, and for a while Texas was loose enough to let him. He turned grudges into murder and swagger into a shield. There were brave men in that time, and there were violent ones, and sometimes they wore the same look from far away. Up close, you could tell the difference. In October 1878, a small town stood still under a clear sky and measured out a legal end to a man who had normalized killing. The wood of that scaffold weathered. The marks of boots on the platform sanded away. People went on with their lives and told the story the way it squared with their sense of the world. Years later, when science set its hand to a spade and a name, bones came up where Giddings said they would, and the question of doubles and escape lost its glow. What stayed bright was the lesson any frontier keeps teaching. The country is wide, justice is slow, and stories outrun both unless someone brings them back to ground. The boys who had watched from the fence grew into men who didn't brag about the day. They plowed fields, fixed fences, and kept their tempers when Saturday nights tried them. They did the quiet work of turning a wild place into a town where the law didn't need a spectacle to be real. A hot wind still comes through Lee County late on fall afternoons. It moves leaves along the courthouse walk and rattles hitch rails no one uses anymore. If you stand there long enough, you can hear men talking in calm voices about times when anger and whiskey ran things. You can hear the creak of a trap and the sudden silence after a drop. And you can hear boots stepping away, because that's what people do when the show is over and it's time to go home. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.